Hello everybody, we've having nicer weather than last week. Welcome to Zube lecture. My name is Frank Sliegers, Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture, directing this lecture series. And I want to thank Stacy and Nathan to be active behind the scenes. And also want to just make a short announcement before I give it over to Mark. So next week we have again Zube lectures. And we have Dr. April Jackson, Assistant Professor, Department of Urban Regional Planning, Florida State University. And she is addressing challenges of diversity, representation, and bias, and discrimination in planning practice. So yeah, please stay tuned and visit us regularly. And I give it over now to Mark Hammond, who introduces our guest today.
Thanks, Frank. So I asked Serin Houston how to pronounce her name, because in Zoom world, we might see it in writing and not actually hear the name spoken out loud. And Serin said to me, Serin as in serendipity. And I thought that was funny because it was serendipity that we first came into communication with each other. One of our first 5 college students to go through the Master of Regional Planning program, Monica Sharma, had attended Mount Holyoke College and had worked with Serin Houston and wanted Serin to be on her thesis committee, her regional planning thesis committee. And that was sort of the starting point of becoming familiar with Serin's research. And I thought, especially this year, given the focus of the Zube lecture series, that it would be a perfect opportunity to invite a fellow 5 college faculty member to come speak with us today. So Serin Houston is a newly minted associate professor of geography and international relations at Mount Holyoke College. Her Master of Arts is in geography from the University of Washington, Seattle. And she also has a PhD in geography and a certificate of advanced study in women and gender studies from Syracuse University. And she will be speaking today about some of her most recent research related to urban governance in Seattle, and particularly the social equity dimensions of planning. So I'm very excited to have Serin joining us today, and I'm very grateful for her coming to speak with us. So Serin, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mark, for the introduction and for the invitation to speak here today. I would also like to thank Stacy Richardson for organizing all of the logistics, and Nathan Chung for making the poster and advertising my talk. And many thanks to all of you for coming to this session of the Zube lecture series. And I'd like to begin my talk by acknowledging that Mount Holyoke College in South Hadley, Massachusetts, where I work and live, occupy Nonotuck land. I ask that we pay our respects to the Nonotuck and other Indigenous stewards of the lands and waters in Western Massachusetts, and to the Indigenous peoples wherever we are each individually situated. I invite you to share in the chat where you are located, and to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples who have lived in the places where we each are, who live here now, and who will live here in the future. Acknowledgement that we come together on colonized land is an important public intervention, a necessary step towards honoring Indigenous communities and joining the broader endeavor to decolonize spaces engaged in knowledge production. Such work is multifaceted and extensive. I offer this land acknowledgement alongside advocacy for action situated within solidarity and reparations. I'd like to share my screen now to pull up the PowerPoint. So in my talk today, I will highlight how unsettling whiteness changed planning practices and produced more inclusive and equitable results during Seattle, Washington's 2009 neighborhood planning efforts. To set the stage for this conversation, first I will provide some context for the city of Seattle. I will then briefly describe my research methods for my book, Imagining Seattle, Social Values and Urban Governance, of which my discussion of neighborhood planning is a part. Next, I will outline some key geographic concepts that animate my research. After this context setting, I will discuss the 2009 neighborhood plan updates for 3 Southeast Seattle neighborhoods: North Beacon Hill, New Holly Othello, and North Rainier Valley, to demonstrate how the unsettling of whiteness produced more inclusive and equitable results. Specifically, I will show how the use of planning outreach liaisons and different locational and linguistic practices compelled the unsettling of whiteness. While Seattle's neighborhood planning still had some shortcomings, which I will review, overall, my findings underscore that it is necessary to unsettle whiteness and center planning approaches focused on equity and social justice. I approached neighborhood planning in Seattle not as a planning practitioner, but as an academic human geographer. From this positionality, I noticed certain patterns and practices that shifted the normative planning approaches and contributed to what I call the unsettling of whiteness. Since I assert that unsettling whiteness was so critical to the success of Seattle's neighborhood planning, I'd like to explain what I mean by this term. I define unsettling whiteness as intentionally disrupting the normative power of whiteness to reproduce racial hierarchies and craft systems, structures, and stances that principally benefit white people. I further use the term unsettling to capture the emotional responses many Seattleites had as they realized the popular depictions of Seattle as progressive did not fully match lived experiences in the city. The phrase unsettling whiteness therefore encapsulates both the structural practices undertaken to upend the centrality of whiteness within Seattle's urban governance and the challenges advanced to what Robin DiAngelo names as white fragility. To be clear, the city offices tasked with facilitating the neighborhood plan updates were not explicitly aiming to unsettle whiteness. Instead, they sought to bear out their social justice values more concretely in neighborhood planning. Through my analysis of their work, I noticed how unsettling whiteness was crucial to realizing these social justice goals. As you may know, Seattle is the largest city in Washington state. When I did my fieldwork in 2009, the population of the city was just over 600,000. The 2019 reported population was nearly 754,000. The racial demographics have stayed relatively stable over the last decade, with about 65% of the residents self-identifying as white, 15% as Asian, 7% as Black, 7% as Latinx, 6% as 2 or more races, and just over 1% as Indigenous and Pacific Islander. The median household income in Seattle was just over $66,000 when I did my fieldwork and has nearly doubled by now. Home values have followed a similar trend. In 2010, the median home value was $379,000, and by late 2020, that number had more than doubled to $783,000. Seattle is often described as the most educated big city in the US, as over 63% of the population holds a bachelor degree or higher. For comparison, just about 40% of the population in the US has a bachelor's degree or higher. Seattle is also commonly known as progressive, green, innovative, a place where city government and local organizations have explicitly worked to implement sustainability, creativity, and social justice policies and procedures, particularly in response to federal withdrawals in these areas. So given this context, my book studies urban governance in Seattle to better understand how specific social values come to fruition and with what impacts. I was especially interested in why sustainable, just, and creative municipal policies do not necessarily produce sustainable, just, or creative outcomes. I gathered my data through 58 semi-structured interviews, archival research, and participant observation. All the names for the participants that I quote in this presentation and in my book are pseudonyms. As a human geographer, I approached my research into social values through a geographic perspective, and particularly relied upon the concepts of imaginative geographies, place, and spatial scale in my analyses. As you may know, imaginative geographies refers to the assumptions about people and place. In the context of my research, imaginative geographies speak to prominent representations of Seattle and help me think through how such portrayals both drive and are shaped by urban governance. I attend to imaginative geographies because we all have them. When I started my talk and mentioned Seattle, you probably had some notions of the place pop into your mind, even if you've never spent time there or know anyone who has lived there. We are steeped in imaginative geographies. Thus, parsing out the contours of imaginative geographies and how they influence our actions is useful. Place is another key analytic in my book. Seattle is clearly a geographical location. I also think about Seattle, though, in terms of sense of place and the attachments people have to this city. Such affiliations often contribute to the stories shared about this place. Questions of what and who are quote unquote in and quote unquote out of place are additional facets of conceptualizing place that thread through my book. Addressing these types of moral geographies resonates with planning, because considering how people move through and conceptualize neighborhoods, for instance, often relates to how people experience a place. If a sense of place and belonging is cultivated or squashed, and if people feel of a place or displaced. In terms of spatial scale, I use this concept to underscore how the translation of sustainability, creativity, and social justice from value into practice varies if we examine such processes at the scale of the individual as compared to the scale of the neighborhood or the city. Drawing out these differences helps me illuminate some of the barriers to the realization of social values. The analytic of spatial scale pertains to neighborhood planning as well, because people can talk past each other and come into conflict in a planning process if there isn't shared recognition of how individual experiences, block level aspirations, community goals, and citywide mandates interface and hopefully integrate within a neighborhood plan. I critically engage with neighborhood planning in my book for 3 key reasons. First, the 2009 neighborhood planning efforts in Seattle mark an exciting example of how a social justice-based approach, one that attends to systems of power and marginalization and unsettles whiteness, produce plans that were more responsive and inclusive. This is an important outcome, so I want to uplift and share this work. Second, as you know, cities are extensively planned places, and as such, the influence of planning on everyday experiences and movement is profound and geographic. It makes sense then to examine both the process and consequences of planning from a geographic perspective. Finally, the entrenchment of whiteness is far-reaching and includes the field of planning. Thus, critically examining planning offers possibilities for considering how to do this profession differently, something I imagine many of you care a lot about. Anna, a city employee in the planning department in Seattle, noted that with planning, quote, "You've got the great expanse of very high aspirational vision with a specific brick and mortar repair," end quote. This wide range of what constitutes planning provides ample opportunities for actualizing social justice. And enacting social justice in and through planning was a key goal with the neighborhood plan updates in Seattle. By 2008, concerns had emerged about the relevance of the existing neighborhood plans, given demographic shifts in the city and evident changes in the built environment, primarily due to the construction of the at-grade light rail line shown on the map on the slide. As you can see, this line travels from the airport through Southeast Seattle to downtown and up to the University of Washington. Given the widespread impacts of the light rail construction, the city government chose 3 neighborhoods in Southeast Seattle for neighborhood plan updates, even though the existing neighborhood plans were about halfway through their originally intended 20-year timeframe. The neighborhoods chosen were, as I mentioned earlier, North Beacon Hill, New Holly Othello, and North Rainier Valley, all of which are located within the red square on the map. It is important to know that Southeast Seattle is the most racially and ethnically diverse part of the city and has the highest share of low-income households. The neighborhood plans are part of Seattle's comprehensive plan which dictates how neighborhoods and the city as a whole will bear out the mandates articulated in the 1990 Washington State Growth Management Act. And although the Growth Management Act did not include an explicit social justice approach, as the current comprehensive plan for Seattle does, city employees involved with neighborhood planning worked to center social justice in the 2009 plan updates. On this point, Anna explained, quote, "One of the guiding principles of the update process is really who is around the table and looking around and asking, is everybody represented?" End quote. Roger, another city employee involved in planning and outreach, added, quote, "There's been a really specific focus on making sure voices are heard, and not just the traditional ones, which are often white, are often homeowners. That's a challenge because those are people that we don't always connect with, so that takes a special level of outreach," end quote. English language learners, people with disabilities, the elderly, and the Black community were particularly sought out for participation in the neighborhood plan updates. Rather than unintentionally reproduce the white privilege and class and linguistic exclusion that had been identified in the 1990s planning process, city employees sought to reconceptualize neighborhood planning by paying attention to social justice. The two city offices tasked with leading the 2009 neighborhood planning process were the Department of Planning and Development, DPD, and the Department of Neighborhoods, DON. DPD and DON still held the traditional community meetings with the usual white homeowning residents in attendance, just as they did in the 1990s planning cycle. Yet, these departments focused the majority of their time and staff resources on more grassroots type community outreach and engagement. For this new approach to neighborhood planning, the DPD and DON modified the trusted advocate model designed by the Annie E. Casey Foundation and created what they called the Planning Outreach Liaison, POL. The POLs in 2009, a group of 13 individuals, worked as bilingual, bicultural bridges between communities and city government and facilitated the neighborhood plan update outreach and engagement process in the 3 neighborhoods. 9 of the POLs were language and cultural translators. 4 worked as liaisons with Asian, Indigenous, and Black communities and people with disabilities. The goal was to invite a wider range of people into the planning process so the plans could be more relevant, sustainable, and supported by an array of residents and people who frequented the neighborhoods. This shifting of planning practices to be more culturally responsive and to focus attention on underrepresented communities contributed to the unsettling of whiteness. In particular, the form of planning meetings and the demographics of participants changed when POLs led the meetings, which displaced some of the normative structures of traditional planning. Additionally, the POLs worked across spatial scales as they cultivated individual, household, and community relationships in order to solicit feedback and input. The past broad-scale practice of sending out a postcard in English to all residents, announcing a planning meeting at City Hall, and taking input from whoever showed up to that meeting was no longer sufficient. Indeed, to learn about the particularities of place and to craft relevant neighborhood plans, different people and processes were needed. The POLs collectively organized and held 80 workshops about the plans. Over 1,650 people attended these gatherings. Additionally, POLs did substantial outreach to and held informal meetings with over 2,700 residents to let people know about the planning process and neighborhood plan specifics and to gather feedback. The POL approach takes seriously the notion that people are the experts of their own lives. Hence, if city government wanted to understand what worked well and what needed changing in the 3 neighborhoods, it made sense to engage the people who spend significant time in these places and to connect with people in varied relevant ways. This was a significant undertaking because, as Anna shared, quote, "Every individual around a table could all live on the same block and their sense of place could be very different, especially if they're from different cultures, different ethnicities. Somebody's sense of place, somebody's core gathering place could be a religious place of worship. For another, it could be a child's school. For another, it could be the coffee house. That ownership of community, it's never static, end quote. Crafting a participatory planning structure that it could accommodate different experiences and perspectives on the neighborhoods was necessary. The POL model strove to account for this multiplicity. Although POLs were initially hired for the neighborhood planning update process, they continue to help with civic projects as community liaisons because they were so instrumental in supporting the municipal government's revised approach to planning. As of 2018, there are over 80 community liaisons representing 40 different languages and communities, working with 15 city departments on outreach and engagement projects throughout Seattle. Allocating resources to community liaisons, rather than repeatedly funding normative practices and processes, underscores how unsettling whiteness can produce material changes. In addition to having POLs facilitate the planning workshops and meetings in the 3 neighborhoods, DPD and DON recognize the value and importance of having discussions about the neighborhood plan updates in familiar places and in familiar languages. Roger recounted how city employees realized that asking residents to come to City Hall to voice their views in a large meeting room could be incredibly intimidating, especially since government offices in Seattle historically have been majority white spaces, and governmental institutions have legacies of committing violence against communities of color throughout the US. So, in contrast, holding the planning meetings in community centers, places of worship, schools, and other community gathering places helped make the meetings more accessible and inclusive. Roger stressed that city employees found that people are, quote, much more forthcoming, much more engaged, much more involved when we're the minority in their majority community rather than the other way around, end quote. He also noted that conducting meetings in the primary language of the community participants rather than defaulting to English made a significant difference as well. The city also provided culturally relevant food, transportation, and childcare in an effort to make the planning meetings more accessible. The visual transformation in planning meetings from city employees standing at the front of the room and presenting information in English to in a city maintained conference room, to city employees sitting and taking notes in the back of a room, wearing headphones for instant translation, and sharing food and ideas with constituents in a community space was really striking to me. The patterns of who spoke and who listened, the spatial arrangement of seating, and the ambience of the rooms were all noticeably different than the typical meeting format at City Hall and the Seattle Municipal Tower. Building on these points, governance is often conceived of with a certain constituent or audience in mind. In this case, the assumed audience for neighborhood planning had been home-owning, English-speaking, and white residents. In 2009, however, city employees shifted their practice in an effort to include a wider and more diverse set of residents and stakeholders in the planning process. The concrete practices of POLs organizing and facilitating meetings, changing meeting locations, offering multilingual engagement, providing food, transportation, and childcare, and investing time in the process so people could understand the purpose and scope of planning demonstrated a commitment to a different way of doing neighborhood planning. This unsettling of whiteness enabled different voices to be heard and included. While these changes stretched the capacity of the municipal government and posed some budgetary and staffing challenges, the outcome of more diverse perspectives shaping the plan updates seemed well worth it. This revised approach to neighborhood planning also challenged dominant imaginative geographies of Southeast Seattle as primarily an economically marginalized and disadvantaged area that lacked many resources. Many city employees began to learn anew about the neighborhoods through listening carefully to residents' concerns and celebrations. Residents' time and experiences were valued, and symbolic compensation emerged through efforts to make meetings accessible and welcoming. The assets of the neighborhoods were foregrounded in tangible ways and recognized more deeply. Through this reshaping of imaginative geographies, residents and city employees alike were more able to agree that job creation, for instance, is important for the area, and to recognize that what job creation actually looks like and what the pathways to producing jobs entails could vary. This was a process of unsettling whiteness and thereby rehumanizing residents of Southeast Seattle. Although the involvement of a wider range of people in the planning process generally earned high praise, some community members registered frustration with the selection process of the POLs. For example, Joanna, who works in the for-profit sector and grew up in Southeast Seattle, outlined her primary concerns. Quote, "I've talked to people who are like, oh yeah, he's a role model for the Vietnamese community. That person didn't even know about this organization or that organization that's been helping the Vietnamese community for years. Just because you choose to stand up and say, I represent the Vietnamese community. Well, do you really?" End quote. Given these apprehensions, Joanna further stated that the most effective POLs would have been people who had long-standing and extensive ties within different ethnic communities and who are not necessarily interested in working with city government, but did so to help their communities. These people are harder to find because they generally do not volunteer right away for this kind of job. Moreover, as Roger noted, quote, "Finding POLs who are neutral within their community, who don't have their own political agendas, is a challenge," end quote. Additionally, the best person to be a POL may not necessarily live in the neighborhood, but could work, shop, and socialize there. Assumptions about who has the right to speak about a neighborhood and envision its future can get ensnarled with property ownership or residential status, which added layers of complexity to the implementation of the POL approach. As both Roger and Joanna's comments indicate, even as the POL structure shifted the planning process and unsettled whiteness to produce greater inclusion than before, the approach was not immune to intra-community concerns about who became the key representatives and bridges between communities and city government. Balancing expectations of what and how community involvement would inform the final updated neighborhood plans emerged as another site of contestation. City priorities for density and significant economic activity often clashed, for instance, with residents' priorities for single-family homes and small businesses. The final plan sought to achieve a middle ground, but elicited some irritation on all sides. Speaking to these points, Michaela, a longtime proud resident of Southeast Seattle, commented, "City employees, quote, claim what they have in place now in the updated plans is what they heard from the community," end quote. Yet, Michaela noted that at the various meetings she attended, community members decried significant upzones in the new Othello neighborhood around the Othello light rail station. Much to her chagrin, she found upzones listed in the updated plan. Consequently, she concluded, quote, "The bottom line is that the city is claiming that they heard from the community and that the plan is the consensus of what they heard," end quote. Yet that was not an accurate representation to her. Sal, a city employee who worked in community outreach, described another planning challenge that presented barriers for actualizing social justice outcomes. She said, quote, "I think the mainstream white community or groups are invested in the 10-year vision. I think that people who have recently moved into Southeast Seattle from other countries, I'm not sure if their thinking is there. I think they are more interested in what is happening now. So if they have an issue, how do you deal with that issue now? Not so much, what do we want Othello to look like in 10 years? I'm not sure if that's what they actually think about. Even though the city would love for them to think that way, I'm not sure if that's really realistic," end quote. Sal highlighted a fundamental tension written into neighborhood plans as products irrespective of the planning process. She noted that many residents in the neighborhoods undergoing plan updates were focused on meeting daily needs and thus did not have the luxury of time and mental and emotional space to envision what the neighborhood could be like in 10 years. They also did not necessarily imagine themselves living in the neighborhood in 10 years. Indeed, the demographics of Southeast Seattle evolved reasonably quickly, which also tests the 10 and 20-year timeframes of planning. As Sal explained, quote, "When I first got here, it was pretty much all Italians. Then it was all Jewish. Then it changed over to Vietnamese, then to Hmong, and now it's East Africans," end quote. As Sal made clear, planning pivots on the assumption of an extended time frame. This mode of thinking may not resonate with all residents, especially when there are immediate concerns that require concerted attention. While city staff did unsettle whiteness and confront racialized hierarchies of power through the POLs and a new take on participatory planning, the fundamental premise of a 10 or 20-year deliverable may have countered some of these actions. Such an outcome compels me to ask, what kinds of flexibility could be built into neighborhood plans to accommodate rapid changes in different lengths of residency in a neighborhood or city? What could a more community curated and revisable plan entail? Recrafting the temporal assumptions and product deliverables in planning could further unsettle whiteness and produce greater equity in the near and longer terms. As I've discussed, in the context of neighborhood planning in Seattle, unsettling whiteness emerged through literally and metaphorically changing who is at the front of the room, driving the planning process and where such meetings occurred. It meant altering what languages were used to conduct a city business, and it included providing food, childcare, and transportation to city residents. City employees did a lot more listening and invested in the assets of the neighborhoods and the notion that people are experts in their own lives. Planners understood the ways in which past practices and business as usual were fueled by whiteness. They sought to disrupt such patterns in the 2009 round of planning. The particularities of unsettling whiteness are clearly context specific. At the same time, I would like to share 3 recommendations based on my research for how to begin unsettling whiteness in planning more generally. I offer these ideas because my research has shown that unsettling whiteness is an effective strategy for advancing social justice. First, recognizing that the current status quo generally reproduces disparities in planning is fundamental. With this understanding in place, internal capacity building work focused on equity and social justice within planning departments, commissions, and organizations can meaningfully occur. If planners are not engaging in evolutions in their own practices, it is difficult to enact systems changes in the communities wherein they work and where planning processes unfold. In Seattle, the municipal-wide Race and Social Justice Initiative had been in action for 5 years by the time the neighborhood plan updates happened. These years of professional development trainings and capacity building work on remaking structures and systems to achieve racial justice compelled and supported the unsettling of whiteness in the neighborhood plan updates. Even if an entire municipal government is not centering equity, planning departments and organizations can make that a priority. Planning departments can provide capacity building and mandatory training to evolve planning practices and approaches. This would help enable changes that could then be translated into the daily practices and outcomes of neighborhood planning. Second, evaluating the structures and practices of existing neighborhood planning is imperative in order to shift away from a normative stance embedded in whiteness. This could mean rethinking everything from the ways in which community participation is facilitated and validated to what a neighborhood plan ultimately looks like. As Monica Sharma, a recent graduate from the Department of Landscape Architecture and Regional Planning, identifies in her master's thesis, the emphasis on normative notions of expert and technocratic information and a constrained understanding of what constitutes professionalism within planning can contribute to the replication of systems and structures that deepen inequities and produce harm. Sharma therefore underscores the necessity for centering frameworks of care, acknowledging and addressing past injustices promulgated through planning, and maintaining a focus on equity throughout planning projects. Such efforts can counter the slow violence of business as usual planning. Building authentic relationships of trust and collaboration are necessary for these evolutions to unfold. My research corresponds with Sharma's findings and shows that practices attentive to the unsettling of whiteness through honest and reflexive appraisals of current practices can challenge harmful pasts and build foundations for more just futures. Third, providing numerous entry points into equity work and recognizing that people approach the work with their own positionalities and understandings is important because, as public administration and policy professor Susan Gooden suggests, many municipal governments, departments, and affiliated institutions exhibit, quote, organizational nervousness, end quote, when it comes to addressing inequities and advancing social justice. Indeed, many employees and institutions alike do not want to directly confront racial inequities. Consequently, Gooden contends, quote, organizational nervousness needs to be effectively managed in order for governmental agencies to proactively address social inequities, end quote. So my third recommendation is to manage resistance and anxiety through providing numerous ways for people to engage in equity and social justice efforts, and through honoring the wide range of life experiences of members of an organization and institution bring to their work. This doesn't mean letting people disengage because they are uncomfortable. On the contrary, it means providing several pathways for engagement and underscoring the message that such involvement is expected in the daily work of the institution. According to Gooden, managing resistance can be done through sustained leadership at senior levels and participation from people throughout an institution. Attending to historical racialized disparities as an important context for contemporary work, striving for structural equity in all decisions, providing accountability, and believing that equity is possible. All of these practices enable the unsettling of whiteness and can substantively remake planning processes. So these three recommendations, centered upon recognizing the harm of the status quo, evaluating structures and practices, and managing anxiety about social justice work, can powerfully contribute to the unsettling of whiteness and planning. In closing, we all have a role to play in creating more equitable and regenerative places. Taking this to heart helps catalyze our imaginations and build our inner resolve as we unsettle whiteness and create systems, structures, and practices focused on collective liberation. Thanks so much, and I look forward to continuing our conversation. Hello, hello, and I think so I can take questions, or how would you like to go now?
Typically, we ask people to either raise their virtual hands or type the question into the chat box and we can unmute them. And some members of the faculty and Monica are co-hosts, so they can just speak more freely.
Excellent. Peter.
Hi, thank you. My name is Peter Condit. Loved your talk. I was wondering how much, in your perspective, does the participatory planning, how much of that is related to budget versus policies?
That's a great question. And actually, one of the things that Seattle found was that it actually cost about the same to do the participatory planning as what they had done before in the previous cycle in the 1990s, which had more people involved, but they were overwhelmingly sort of similar demographically. And so it was a smaller number of folks in the 2009 cycle, but it was a much wider range. And so as folks in Seattle would talk about, you know, your budget, you realign it to meet your values, you know, and you shift your allocations to bear out your goals. And so budget and governance like have to go together. And one of the things that I write about in my book that was also really exciting in Seattle is that every line item in the Seattle city government budget has to go through an equity filter. And so all of the kind of resource distributions, you know, are kind of thoughtfully engaged with. And so that did enable, you know, a lot of the participatory planning and extensive outreach that they do to kind of, you know, happen. I will note though that, you know, the city employees that I interviewed and engaged with were, you know, spending a lot of time and they, by the end of the sort of 6 months of this intensive period of neighborhood plan updates, were a bit like, whew, I might need a couple of years before I do this kind of community engagement, this level again. So that question about capacity is a really good one that I think is still being wrestled with on a routine way. But I guess that's a long way of saying that I think budget and policy need to be aligned in order to have these sorts of approaches come to fruition.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And yeah, we have a lot of questions pouring in. We got Monica, Mark, and Thomas. So Monica, you can unmute. You're a co-host.
Okay, sorry. I just wanted to say thank you so much, Serin. And I was able to read your book before I moved to Seattle, and I'm now working in the field in Seattle. So I'm actually in the middle of a job, but I just wanted to say it's really incredible to see all of this kind of firsthand after reading the way that you described it. So this is less of a comment, less of a question more than a comment, but thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Monica. And thank you again, as Mark said earlier, for facilitating our connections and for your fabulous research too. It's really exciting to be in dialogue with you about these ideas in this space as well. So thank you. And I'll have to hear more about, yeah, we miss you, Monica, for sure. And I'm interested to hear more about how you're thinking about Seattle and what you're noticing, because there have certainly been a lot of changes since I was living there full time. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, and we got Professor Mark.
Thanks, Nathan, and thanks, Serin, for a fantastic talk. So I just want to make a quick comment and ask a question. So the comment is you have a remarkable talent for not pulling any punches in terms of critical assessment and identifying the magnitude of the challenges that we face structurally, and also combining that with a tone of optimism and possibility in terms of what can be done. So, I think it's a real talent to be able to maintain that balance between those two perspectives. So I just wanted to commend you for that. And then the question I wanted to ask, 2 weeks ago, Bryce Merriman came and talked about homelessness in Seattle, and within conventional public participation process or planning process, communication goes to home addresses. And I wonder whether in your research engagement with homeless or housing insecure or housing unstable populations was a greater challenge.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And that, when I was there and doing research, there was very much this focus on we're going to end homelessness by 2015. It's just not going to be present in the city. And that was part of, speaking to the imaginative geographies of Seattle as this progressive city that's, that's politically left, it's going to do all this great work. And that's very much not been, housing has become even less attainable and less accessible, and more folks are moving out or are pushed out or are housing insecure and unhoused. So that, those tensions are still very, very much there. And I think in some ways they're actually further amplified from when I did my research. And in terms of how did the neighborhood planning process unfold in relationship to connecting with folks who are unhoused, part of that practice, as you were saying, of sending out the postcard to all addresses. One of the noticing about how that was not an effective strategy was by attending to wait a minute, not everyone has an address that they can receive their mail at. So there was this kind of real time oh wait, this is not the best approach for us. Yet the communities that were unhoused was not one of the sort of targeted communities that was especially sought out to participate in the neighborhood planning process, the updates. So I didn't speak with any city employees who are explicitly working with unhoused folks or housing insecure folks and trying to make sure that they came to meetings. I would hope that people maybe did, and I just didn't hear about it. But it was much more focused on English language learners, folks who are elderly, people with disabilities, and the Black community. And so that's where the efforts were largely placed. And in terms of where larger, there's been different tent cities around Seattle, and those have moved around the city, and sort of where the kind of greater congregations of unhoused folks might be in sort of these informal settlements. Southeast Seattle hasn't had as much of a presence of that. Some of that has to do with the public, there's not a lot of public bathrooms, for instance. Like the bus lines aren't like as reliable or as extensive. There aren't like great sidewalks. The parks aren't, there aren't as many parks. And, so all these other sorts of factors that can contribute to meaning that there are kind of a smaller number of visible unhoused folks, in the neighborhoods where the updates were happening. Of course, that's not to say at all that there aren't unhoused people or housing insecure people in those places. It's more to suggest, that it was less visible. And to speak to your point about optimism, I have to say, as you can probably tell, working with learning about the Race and Social Justice Initiative, and then working with folks throughout city government who are implementing, translating this, ideals into practice, was tremendously inspiring to me. I was in meetings with folks who are like the level of discourse and attentiveness to structural racism and white privilege, and being able to then like really think through their everyday work and shift it. I had never seen anything like that before. And it really challenged a lot of my assumptions about what bureaucracy looks like and things like that. So I found it really energizing. And then, working with folks, and as you could tell, participant observation was a big part of my research methodology. So I was at a lot of these meetings and, roaming around the neighborhoods, talking with folks about the places they love and the things they wanted to hope could be different. It felt to me that there was a lot more than just talk. There was a lot of, actual practices that were quite notable. So that continues to inspire me now.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we have actually 4 more people asking questions. I think Thomas has his or her hand raised for a while. So I'm going to ask Thomas to unmute.
Well, thank you for presenting today. That was really informative. I just have one question. So I didn't quite get it. I think I was writing something down at the time, but what was the problem that on the map of the planning that wasn't being shown? Like there was a point where you were talking about that some of the residents were talking that their ideas hadn't been put into the plan. What exactly was that part of the plan? I didn't think I heard it.
Yeah, great question. And that was about Upzones. Are you familiar with Upzones?
Sorry, I'm not really.
Okay, great. Thank you for asking. So Upzones is, part of a zoning regulation that is sort of specifying how tall a building is going to be, and often then gets folded into like what kinds of purposes that the buildings will have. And so Southeast Seattle has a pretty low profile, if you will. It's generally kind of, single family homes and a few buildings that were, a couple story, maybe 3 or 4 stories or something, but not anything that's upwards of like 6 or 8 stories. And around the new light rail stations, so the Acre light rail was put like right through the middle of Southeast Seattle. And of course, these kinds of hugely disruptive infrastructural practices through predominantly communities of color and working class communities we see this in cities all over. This is a pretty unfortunately common sort of practice. But so, the city really wanted to have the taller buildings. They wanted to have what they called the Upzones. So they wanted to have 6 to 8 floor buildings around the light rail station so that they could have apartments. There'd be mixed use. So they'd have residential and commercial and educational facilities kind of all there, with the idea that, then people could, get off the light rail and be home, or, get on the light rail very easily to move around the city. And so Michaela was the person I was quoting, who was saying like, no, we, like all of us residents who've been here for a long time said, no, we don't want those big buildings. And we don't want those, large massed buildings where, they're prominent, on the landscape. And when you're walking down the sidewalk or the street, you feel the shadow of them, and they are more, sort of obvious. And so that was what I was referring to. She was feeling like every meeting she went to, people said no, no, no to Upzones. And then she looked at the, revised plan, and it had all these Upzones. And she's like, so really, did you take into account the community perspective? I don't think so. So that was the example that I was giving there.
Thank you for explaining.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for your question.
And we have a Sophie. Let me see if I can. Okay, you can unmute.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much for your talk. It was really amazing. I was more wondering if, and I know that this is more of a new thing, but I think that the pandemic added a new level of community needs, and if the skills and policies and practices that were developed actually benefited the city in providing assistance to communities.
That's such a great question. And, and I think like Seattle is endlessly fascinating to me as a city, because it is a place where there's really high concentrations of wealth. And we still, so we see what I would call like, remarkable, more notable kind of policy interventions and aspirations and commitments. And we still see kind of a lot of wealth and, sort of a lot of normative whiteness and all kind of aspects of life. So, like the autonomous zone that was created in the, just before the pandemic in the early times, I think speaks to kind of how there's, folks are feeling really, residents are feeling really frustrated by the level of gentrification, the level of kind of, promoting corporate interests and sort of capital accumulation over everyday wellness. And the Seattle continues to struggle as a city with their policing. It continues to be, very much critiqued for, particularly harming communities of color. So with all that being said, though, there's of course like incredible kind of mutual aid organizations. There's a lot of, kind of radical activism. You can look back to, Seattle likes to look at the 1999 Wto Protest as this kind of example of, pretty widespread social mobilizations around, around particular ethos and aspirations. So what I would say, we've seen evolutions. Like one of the a piece of evidence of that is, when I was there, like sustainability felt, my analysis of it in my book was that it's still very much a class and racialized as white kind of endeavor. And subsequently, there's much more focus on environmental justice within the sustainability office now. There's much more focus on, they have a new kind of equity lens that they use to kind of filter their project, as a kind of guiding framework for their projects. So I think it's kind of the both and. Like there's lots of great work happening and still commitments to, bearing out the goals of having a place where they say they're, working to eliminate institutional racism, and create a city where, everyone can thrive. So that's still very much the goal, and still there's policies and practices, put into place related to that, and there's still like massive disparities that are, evident in a lot of sectors. So I don't know if that fully answers your question.
It does. Thank you. I think it's one of those questions that might take a day to respond, and you did it really well.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you. And we got Professor Henry, April, and then April. There are two Aprils, but Professor Henry, do you have a question?
Well, I actually think April was ahead of me in line. That April that's raised the hand in the chat. So I'll go after that.
I think April Liu. Yeah, let's hear from you.
Professor Houston.
Hi, thanks for coming.
I feel like my question isn't as like specific or like it's not as good as the other questions, but, and you kind of answered this already, but I was wondering what I really like how you incorporated imaginative geographies. And if I were to like engage in this type of research, that wouldn't be the first thing that I thought of. So I was wondering what the most significant way that your perspective on Seattle's imaginative geography is like shifted, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, I think, the prominent imaginative geography that like circulates in popular press that, you even see it like in films and things like that is like this kind of glossy, Seattle is so, it's so politically progressive, it's liberal, it's sustainable, it's, this is kind of, this is our model city. Like, this is where we should turn and sort of say, like, how can we replicate what is happening there? And that was, interesting to me. And then that was sort of how I knew about Seattle before I heard about it before I moved out there for graduate school. And what I found was so important about the lens of imaginative geographies was it helped me kind of identify that prominent narrative that circulates in all kinds of ways. And then notice how that narrative sort of blinded a lot of us from being able to notice what was actually, the experiences on the ground. Sort of like, so, we didn't really want to see the inequities because that didn't quite fit with the notion of Seattle as, progressive, green, innovative, all these things. And so I was curious how, like, city employees in particular, how they wrestled with kind of, their beliefs and their dreams and their imaginative geographies of how Seattle is as a place, with actually then sort of looking at the material, everyday embodied experiences and sort of paying attention to that. So, and it would come through in interviews where folks would, sort of wax poetic about how just exceptional and fabulous Seattle is, and then be like, well, and actually, here are some of our challenges that we just can't kind of, fully wrestle with. And so that tension, to me, or that kind of recognizing of this more holistic view, was really important in my book. And so in terms of my own imaginative geography of Seattle, I'm much more able to kind of recognize the parts or identify and sort of highlight the parts that I think are, working to create substantive social change, and hold that alongside, the very wide range of evidence about what, what's the remaining work to be done. And I was, I think imaginative geographies is useful to pay attention to, because if we only focus on kind of how we want things to be, it's a lot easier to avoid actually changing our practices, and creating the frameworks that are going to bring about that vision of the kind of idealized city, if you will. So does that, tell me how that resonates with you, April, or does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I really think it's interesting how like our perspectives on imaginative geographies can be changed by listening to like firsthand accounts.
Absolutely. And yes, and I think that is such a wonderful reminder of the importance of being open to that new information, right? Or different perspectives, rather than just sort of sticking with the like, here's the vision that I have, and so it must stay this way, right?
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
And I think we have a question from Professor Henry, and also a comment from April Graham Jackson. I think this person knows you, Professor Serin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, April. I'm so glad you're here.
Yeah, Professor Henry, would you like to ask a question, or should April speak out or comment? What do you think?
April, would you like to speak out your comment?
Let me unmute this person. Yeah, you can unmute April.
Mine's a little bit off topic, so I don't mind saving it for later. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to just say thank you so much for this extraordinary talk to my wonderful and magnificent geography mom. And just, just that this is such a reminder to me as a graduate student that still just kind of just struggles and grapples with a lot of just a lot of, I guess questions of figuring out how to produce research that really speaks to the significance of geography without like flattening it or taking it for granted. And so I think this just really just reminded me of how we're able to think and hear and see and feel geography and how we can implement that into our methodological designs and our theoretical approaches. So I felt like I was back in the classroom with you at Mount Holyoke. So I just wanted to say thank you again so much for this and for that reminder of why I'm in graduate school. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for coming, April. It's so lovely to hear your voice and have your presence here. And so everyone knows, April is doing this incredible work. And I'm really excited about, I was talking about spatial scale and, April's theorizing what we might think about as Black scale. And so I know that we're going to continue to have really rich conversations, April, and my research and ideas will continue to evolve because of you. So thank you.
So what's left? I was just going to say, I looked up your bio when I saw your talk listed because I thought it was real interesting. I noticed that you actually have some emerging interests in examining the impacts of climate change migration on the Pioneer Valley, which is really interesting because I think the vast majority of the planning faculty and a number of the landscape architecture faculty in our department recently got together and collaborated on NSF planning grant on exactly that same topic.
Oh, really?
I had known about 3 months ago that you were also interested in that, but maybe this is just like we set up a different Zoom meeting because it does seem like we have a lot of overlapping interests on that topic. And, I just wanted to kind of mention that since you were our guest today, but I don't want to put you on the spot on something that's not related to what you're planning to talk to, but just like, oh, fantastic, and if we get the planning grant, then there's, the point of it is to put together a big team of people to really, really look at this issue and, go after, maybe a more substantial, type of funded research program in that area. So just wanted to throw that out there in case, you were interested, and maybe we can set up a Zoom for another time.
Yeah, that sounds fabulous. I would love to do that. And I can already think of also several students who, when that big grant comes and when there's funding for, more collaborators, I would love to, think about that as well. And I want to mention, as another moment to acknowledge and thank Monica, because my initial engagement and sort of way into thinking about human migration and climate change was actually in the context of Kiribati in Oceania. And 3 years ago was when I was planning to be there doing field work with folks. And I was particularly interested in kind of these questions of sense of place, how people engage with and understand and work to kind of preserve, if you will, a sense of place when in the midst of really acknowledging profound environmental change. And at that time, communities in Kiribati were, there was a vision and a plan to have a collective migration to Fiji, to land that was purchased there. And I was really interested in sort of like, how does one, make sense of that? And how do you think about that? And particularly in communities where, connections with ancestors and like deep, interweaving with the land, like how in the ocean, how do you navigate that? But didn't make it there because the border closed to researchers and journalists as we were kind of on our way. Sort of pivoted, and a really important learning from that, which is why I'm telling this whole story, informs my work and emerging work here, is a deep recognition of kind of, who was I as someone of the global minority coming to a global majority place, saying, oh, we're like, what's happening? Like, how are you going to manage these really terrible, futures and current moments? And it just started to feel like really really neo-colonial and very extractive in ways that I try to not do in my work. And I try to be super, attentive to these kind of power dynamics and ethics. And so, and as a migration scholar, hitting a hard border was really great. That was a truly humbling and transformative experience. I might not have used that language at the moment because I was pretty frustrated that it didn't work out, but to really recognize the ways in which I had assumed all kinds of privileges and access was just, it helped me grow as a person so much. And then Monica shared, I'm starting to work with some folks here in Holyoke around kind of thinking about, post Hurricane Maria and sort of networks of care and support and sort of, all these kind of questions. And so Monica was the one who introduced me to some folks in this area. And then that got me, I became, perhaps you all know the Climigration Network, which is a really neat international network of climate migration folks and its policy and applied people and academics and community members. So it's really fascinating group. And so I started, getting involved with them, and that brought me to really think carefully about the term managed retreat and what that means. And then thinking about climate gentrification and sort of, settler colonialism, and so all of those are the kinds of questions that I'm thinking about here in Western Mass. So I'd love to have further conversations. And congratulations, that's so neat that you all put together that grant.
Yeah, no, we like I said, we'll have to set something up for a future time, but thank you for taking a few minutes to kind of explain how you kind of came to where you are. So
yeah, certainly not a linear path.
Here we are.
Yeah, and really kind of bringing in my urban geography and critical migration studies kind of into conversation. So thanks. I see Humera, you have your hand raised.
Yes, thank you so much for your talk. It was a real delight to hear you speak. We're neighbors to the north in Hadley, and there's a community of us who are having conversations about racial justice over the last year. And we are this month and next stepping into conversations about the history of US housing discrimination and local housing policy. My colleague, Tony Lin, who's another colleague in Hadley, is posted a note about this in the chat. And it's been really eye-opening to see how the history of planning in our nation has really created segregated communities systematically. And our reading is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. It's quite eye-opening and very very intense and very angering. But I'm going to focus my question for you on when you bear witness to what's happening in Seattle, how does the community wrestle with that history, especially with other communities around the nation, like Evanston, Illinois, suburb in Chicago, that this week just agreed to reparations for their Black residents who were denied the ability to purchase housing and denied the ability to acquire wealth and all the other things that come with that. So how did that play out in the planning discussion? I can see just from my local planning politics that it's very guarded, and I can see why they'd want to keep the conversation very limited. But how did that play out in Seattle?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question and for sharing the work that you're doing. This is so exciting, and I'm teaching urban geography right now, and in a couple of weeks we'll be talking about what it sounds like you all are very engaged with too. So I've so many synergies here, and to be honest, in the conversations that I had during my research, one of the big silences was generally about, settler colonialism and indigenous people. And it was basically an absence in, most of the conversations and most of the discussions and most of the actions and plans. And there was a lot more focus on here are current residents. And there was acknowledgement that South Seattle, the ways in which, redlining had, I was going to show a map, the Homeowners Loan Corporation map, which, you know, the neighborhoods that were had the neighborhood updates were all of the definitely declining and hazardous, you know, according to that redlining practice, which of course, you know, set in motion and solidified all kinds of disparities. And so there was recognition of that history and a sense that, well, if we're shifting budgets, if we're shifting our policies, if we're, you know, cultivating plans that are going to be with different people making them, hopefully we're not going to then replicate something that in 50 years people will look back and be like, what? How did you do that? Or like, how was that seen as a reasonable way forward? And so that there wasn't much talk about reparations in any sort of explicit way. With that being said, though, now there's, you know, since I was there, and granted, you know, it's been a decade, there's a sort of growing movement around land rents. And so there's folks, you know, for the Duwamish in particular, who pay, you know, monthly settlers, you know, who pay a monthly contribution or one time, however, you know, people can do as is feasible in a way of kind of financially, you know, working towards some sort of reparations. And so I think there's a lot more calls for that. And then just even if I might for a moment, you know, mention another area of my research is sanctuary social movements and sanctuary urban policies. And so, you know, Evanston's an interesting place in that regard too, like one of the early, you know, sites in the US that had some sanctuary policies, which were also still quite neoliberal in their rationale for why a place would offer what might be called sanctuary. So I think Seattle's, you know, it has folks in the city council now, you know, who are attentive to all these factors. So, you know, lots of residents are really attentive. I think until there's a true reckoning with, you know, the incredible focus on capital expansion, you know, until there's really some substantive work on that, I'm not sure how much, you know, some of the reparations kind of work is going to unfold. But I'd be curious, you know, as, you know, one of the things that was really neat about when I was there was a lot of the folks who were in city government were community organizers prior to, you know, working in the government. And that had been a really big push of the mayor at the time, was to bring in, or the mayor who started the Race and Social Justice Initiative, was to bring in all these community organizers who were really, you know, they were like, people all had their pedagogy of the oppressed, and, you know, like there was like a, you know, and really engaged in conversations that were quite dynamic. And to be honest, I don't know where those sorts of dynamics are at now, if that's still kind of a strong presence.
Sounds
which
like
I think helped.
In a sense, laying the groundwork for what could happen as a national conversation comes to a crescendo.
And I think as that national conversation comes to a crescendo, part of Seattle's imaginative geography is that they'd want to be a part of it, you know? So I think it is sort of interesting to then see, like, so they want to be a part of it. Are they going to do the other kinds of work that are going to mean more than just talk, right?
Right. Great. Thank you so much. And by the way, we are opening up to all the surrounding communities and welcome folks to register to join that conversation. It's at hadleylearns.com. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Excellent.
So I think we're probably at the end of our formal conversation, but if people want to hang around for a few minutes and ask questions, that's completely fine. But I think this is a good opportunity to thank Serin again for a fantastic talk, which stimulated a fantastic discussion. So thank you.
Thank you. So great to be here with you all today. It's so nice to see you, and thank you all for coming. I really am so honored to be in community and in dialogue and conversation with you. And I'm very much happy. Yeah, I can stay if folks want to stick around or have any questions.
Thank you. And then I'll stop the recording now.
Thank you, Nathan.